I'm not seeing anything.
Not either. Well, folks, I'm Caleb Johnston, and that is the botched intro for the show. So hope you enjoyed that, being totally botched. But anyway.
It speaks to the quality of our work.
I know, right? I had the video playing, but it was apparently in a different window than the one I decided to share with you guys. So it was there. You just couldn't see it. I saw it. So
you'll just have to use your imagination for tonight.
I could do it for us.
We could stop and go back, but I think we'd have more chance of losing even more listeners that way, trying to run it again versus just moving on. You can add that back in post-production, right, Joel?
Yeah, there you
go. Yeah.
All right.
I won't because I'm lazy, but I could.
Fair enough. So, as I said, I'm Caleb Johnston. Down here diagonal from me, right over this way, is the one and only. And then right over here, see, I hate doing this. Over this way, we've got
Clinton Wilcox.
I thought you were only Zool.
Yeah, for tonight.
Okay. And then new face tonight that you all may or may not recognize, right down here below me. And what is your name, good sir?
It's Steve. Just Steve.
Just Steve. Well, welcome to the show, Steve.
So one name like Cher.
Yeah, exactly. It's more effective that way. Okay. I mean, it's like Blue's Clues. Do you know his last name? But you know who Steve is.
That's true.
Good point. So, Steve, since it's your first time with us, and Steve, for everybody, Steve is a network member. So he joined the team fairly recently, but he's been doing ministry for quite a while. So give the listeners just a little bit of background and rundown of kind of you and your projects, and then we'll give some more time at the end to just give a sales pitch of where people should go to find more of you.
Absolutely. Yep. So my name's Steve Schramm. Basically just grew up in church all my life. I became a Christian, I believe, at the age of 4 years old, and I've just been doing my best to serve the Lord ever since. I didn't really give much thought to my faith until I guess it was maybe 2016, mid 2016. I just kind of had this random thought, like, what if this Jesus dude I've always heard about, like, never even lived? Do we only talk about this inside of like my particular church context? And so I began to do some research on that and absolutely fell in love with biblical studies and apologetics and theology. And now all of a sudden I have T-shirts and coffee cups with a Bible nerd logo on it. And so that's so what I do. I try to get people excited about the Bible. That's kind of where I spend my ministry time and time writing and speaking and podcasting, stuff like that. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. It's always exciting when we can bring somebody new in to liven up the conversations, because we tend to get pretty dull after a while.
That's our gimmick here. We keep a rotating cast of people that listeners get used to and then disappear and never come back.
Right.
That's pretty much how it goes.
Well, I hope I can contribute something.
Yeah, the most important question, though, do you affirm the virgin birth?
I do affirm it.
Yeah. All right. Well, that'll make a certain someone happy.
Yes, it will.
All right. So, Joel, I'm going to turn things over to you since you're leading our discussion tonight. I know listeners may be very excited to kind of dive into a real capstone kind of point in the research that we're kind of always coming up in some context of some kind. So take it away.
So we've been teasing this one for like, what, a year? This
Maybe
is the
more.
episode where we actually dive into the research that I've done on deconversion. Now, listeners to the podcast will have heard interviews, or at least one interview that I participated in on my research. So they've kind of heard the layout of the 5-stage model that I've developed already. If you're just watching the stream, that's not something that we've really gone into yet. But even for our podcast listeners, I'm going to try to, being one of the hosts of this show, I'm going to try to dive in and control the conversation in a way that you didn't get for the interview. So there's still content to be had. First, I'd like to talk about how I got to this point in the first place. So I started in apologetics as a journalist. I was a freelance writer and I was looking for work. And one of the jobs that presented itself was an online news organization called The Examiner. Now, every town in the world has something titled The Examiner. It's not the one you're thinking of. It was an internet news source. And their policy for, their model behind news was to hire nothing but freelancers because freelancers are inexpensive. And then to give each freelancer a beat specific to that person. So they had hundreds of thousands of people working for them, and each one had a very specific beat. So you might have been the cupcake examiner, and your entire job was to write news stories about cupcakes and maybe recipes and places that would open up. You had one examiner that I ran across was the Ron Paul examiner, meaning that his only job in the world was to write news about a single politician. So I was given the news beat of Christian apologetics. Now, all four of us have traveled in the world of Christian apologetics. It's a deep field with a lot of content, but not a lot of news. There aren't scandals and, participations in politics and things going on at the apologetic level that would be helpful for somebody who's supposed to be writing regular news on them. So as a result, I had to kind of come up with material that would be interesting for readers and related to apologetics, so that I can continue to create content. So at one point I decided, hey, I have all of these stories I've been collecting of atheists that converted to Christianity. It would be a really cool thing to do for maybe a month, every day in a month, to do an article, a brief biography of the conversion event of an atheist. How did this atheist become a Christian? So I collected these stories until I had enough to do a month of articles on it. And it just happened to be February, which is a nice month if you're going to do a day-by-day article release. But unfortunately for me, it was a leap year, so I had more days to handle than most Februaries would allow. Despite the fact that I only released 29 articles, I actually wrote about 32 on this subject. So I did that, and it became the most popular series that I'd ever written. It was republished on several other websites, including The Poached Egg and Ratio Christie's outlet and Premier Christianity magazine in the UK, all republished this series that I did. And now Justin Brierley of Unbelievable is writing a book on conversion, and he's borrowing some of my material for the book that he's writing, which is kind of cool. I don't know if he'll credit me in the acknowledgments, but here's hoping. Anyways, so the interesting thing for me is I have a background in psychology. I won't get into detail with that. It's interesting because it's a very accidental background in psychology. I didn't want a degree in psychology. I wasn't interested in psychology, but I got one anyway, against my protests. And then when I started writing for The Examiner as an apologetic examiner, I started following atheist feeds because, where else does apologetics news come from, right? And the feed that I followed was a podcast. It was a well-done podcast. It wasn't as mocking as, it wasn't the atheist experience, It was actually somewhat intellectual and respectful. Not entirely. They still, made fun of Christians, but not to the, mocking degree that you get elsewhere. Anyway, one of the panel on that particular podcast was Luke Galen, who is a professor of psychology himself. And so one of the regular bits that they did on every episode was his bit on psychology of religion. So a lot of the early apologetics that I did ended up addressing psychology of religion. So with my background in psychology, I brought that to the fore, and then I was doing psychological apologetics for the early part of my career as an apologist. And so as I'm publishing these stories of atheists that became Christians, I'm starting to see trends, and based on my background, I'm like, whoa, this is cool. So I did a case study because I wanted to. And one of the responses I got on the series of atheists that converted to Christianity were atheists that read my articles and came back and said, well, more Christians are becoming atheists than the other way around, right? So we're winning. And, other ones came on and were like, what you need to do is be fair and balanced in your approach and write a series on Christians that deconverted to atheism. Well, I had no interest in doing that while I was writing the series. But then as I was doing this case study, I was like, this would be really interesting to find out what the path of a Christian who deconverts is like. So I sat on that for several years before I ended up doing it. And at first, it was like any other episode of this show that I do. I find a subject that's interesting. I research it. I write up conclusions. I script it out, and then I do an episode. And that's essentially what I was going to do. I was going to publish an article, do an episode, and call it a day. But it accidentally became my life's work. So at this point, I have read dozens of books and research papers and theses and journal articles and so forth on the subject of conversion and deconversion. I'm studying both. And then I've done my own case study research on the topic. And I only recently wrote up the conclusions of that study. So this has been going on for about 3 years now. I've been working on this. And the interesting thing is that whereas the conversion of an atheist had trends and patterns that were interesting to me, the deconversion of a Christian is almost a railroad. It is so consistent across the board that I was able to develop a model that I wasn't for an atheist that becomes a Christian. Yeah, there were trends, there were similarities, but I wasn't able to develop a model like I am now. So that's the background leading up to the research that I've done. You guys want to jump in and say anything about that before I go into my model?
I'm just, I guess I kind of see where you're, now that you mentioned that, in terms of trends, I definitely could see where there would be some trends in terms of atheists who become a Christian. It could be some sort of major, tragedy, some sort of life event. I'm sure those patterns are there, but just based on what I have heard from you so far tonight and in other contexts, and just seeing the patterns come alive before my eyes in recent days, definitely appears that there are some consistencies that are really easy to track down, or not easy to track down. You've obviously spent a lot of time trying to track them down, but kind of in hindsight, after you see them, it's like, whoa, kind of opens your eyes to it. So yeah, I'm excited to discuss that further.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I have, since then, I've read a paper that did the same research of atheists that became Christians. And then there's another paper that I am reading. It's about 500 pages. So it's still in process on the same subject.
So some light summer reading.
Yeah. But no, it's interesting because now that I've read those papers and looked back on the case study I did, yeah, there is a pattern. There's a model that I could go into. And someday we'll do an episode on that. But for right now, just the boring subjects of deconversion. So if you guys are ready, I'll go ahead and jump in on that.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So the first thing we need to do is talk definitions. So when you look at any kind of academic research, definitions are super important. You and I could get together and say, yeah, I was talking to this atheist the other day and he said this. And of course, what he believes is blah, blah, blah. But, if I was doing a research paper and I use the word atheist, I would then have to, in the beginning of the paper, define what I mean by atheist. And so in this case, it's important to define what I mean when I talk about deconversion, because the term itself is somewhat controversial. In conversion research, in the psychology of conversion and fields related to study of religious conversion, the idea is that you move from one state of mind, one worldview, to another. There is this conversion. You convert. You move in your mental state from characterizing the world and everything around you in one way to characterizing it in another. And so that's a conversion. And again, that definition's a little, but the idea is you move positions. Now, there are researchers that use that and say, well, deconversion is really just another kind of conversion. You're moving from one mindset to another. But then there's the thing that, let's say I were to tomorrow decide to become a Muslim. I have then converted. I've moved from Christianity to Islam. But, researchers will point out, well, you also just deconverted, right? You moved away from Christianity to something else. Well, I would just characterize that as a conversion, because if I were to be, a guy on the street who doesn't have any kind of religious views whatsoever and become a Christian, I'm still converting to something. I'm not deconverting, I'm converting. Because I'm changing to a new mind. I use the word deconversion to describe a move away from religion. And as we talk about this, what you'll see is in deconversion, it's more characterized by what you oppose than by what you embrace. An atheist, a person who labels themselves an atheist, would not do so unless there were such a thing as religion. The label atheism doesn't mean anything without a religious concept around against which to reference oneself. So having said that, I'd like to make a distinction between deconversion and disaffiliation. So there's we're all in the field of apologetics. About a year ago at this point, every apologetics feed, podcast, blog was all talking about a Pew report that said that, we're dying in the West. Everybody's dropping away from churches. They're shrinking, this huge thing. And so the idea might become that, hey, deconvergence is happening all around us every day, everywhere. But most of what is happening is disaffiliation. The difference is that when you're deconverting, you are moving from taking a strong stance on your religious views to another strong stance on your religious views. When you label yourself an atheist, you are making a theological statement about yourself and about your relationship with religion. On the other hand, if you disaffiliate, you kind of wander off to other interests. You don't go back to church. You may not like church. You may not like Christians. Maybe you think that their political views are unsavory, but you don't take a position on the existence of God or on more theological positions like where does morality come from and so forth. You're not one of them. You don't characterize yourself. In the Pew report, you would be a none, N-O-N-E. And so, this is the difference between deconversion and disaffiliation. So when we see somebody deconvert, they're typically somebody who was very invested in religion. Oftentimes the stories that I'm reading are people who had a ministry of their own, or they were ministry leaders, or they were doing mission trips every week. These were people who a lot of their identity was drawn up in Christianity. On the other hand, if you're a pew filler and after church, you go out with the guys for beers, and then you just start going out with the guys for beers instead of going to church, and eventually that becomes your life and not going to church, there's no big transition in your life because Christianity was compartmentalized among many interests that you had. And then eventually that compartment was kind of shoved aside and you pursued your other interests instead. On the other hand, an atheist never got rid of the religious compartment. They just switched poles on that compartment. And so that is the distinction I'm making between deconversion and disaffiliation. Any questions about that before we go?
Yeah. So does, and I'm sure we're going to get to this, but does that part of the research say anything about whether the disaffiliated person was actually a converted person, or does it assume that that person wasn't converted? Sorry, I know there's a distinction between the two, but does what you're talking about have, is there any relation at all on the conversion status, or whatever you would call it, of the person who's disaffiliated?
That's interesting that you bring that up, because conversion is really the question here. And it's, I've studied conversion theory. I've looked at the different models of conversion. And again, I'm doing this from the social sciences point of view, not from, a theological or apologetic point of view. And, there are people in churches who have never undergone what would be called a formal conversion experience. They maybe grew up in the church and they're there because their parents were there, and they just kind of, it was a thing that was done, going to church, and eventually they just stopped going to church. It may be that they did join the church for some reason or other, and then wandered away. Now, was that a conversion process? So I'll briefly touch on the two different models of conversion. The first model is what's called a crisis conversion. And a crisis conversion is the type that, tends to be, it's the superstar of conversion experiences. It's the one that gets all the attention. Sorry, I'm reading the private chat here. Nothing I can do, Caleb. Sorry.
It's all good. It magically seemed to fix itself, and it's now synced up. So
awesome. Okay, so crisis conversions. Crisis conversion is the sort of come to Jesus moment, see the lights, Paul on the road to Damascus kind of experience, where some sudden thing happens in your life, a lightning bolt strikes you out of the air, the heavens open up before you, and suddenly, wow, you're a Christian. There's this demarcation line between not saved and saved that occurs. And this is still the popular perception within the church, because we have things like altar calls. You come up, you talk to this person up at the front who receives you and prays with you, and bam, you're converted. You go from being not Christian to Christian in this one act of kneeling before the altar at the front of the church. Crisis conversion. All right, so that's that. And then the other model is a process conversion. And a process conversion takes into account the fact that there are stages you move through between being not a Christian and being a Christian. And again, this is from a social sciences point of view. So, this won't necessarily match up with what is taught in systematic theology, but it will match up with what you see happen with people. And that would be that an individual goes through a period of time that they become a seeker. Now, what that means is that this person is actively desiring some kind of change in their life. Typically, it's because there's something going on in their life that they'd like to resolve. So there's some kind of discomfort in their life. And so they become a seeker for some kind of solution. They go into a problem-solving mode. And as they problem solve, religion becomes a possible solution to the problem. So they become open to the possibility of identifying as religious. Sometimes they become open to that idea by encountering a religious individual and forming some kind of relationship with that person. And then, that opens their mind to the possibility that, hey, this guy seems okay. Maybe that's the solution for me. And from that, they begin to form a relationship with that person. Then they begin to enter the community. As they participate in that community, they start to adopt the values of that community. And then there's a commitment event, like an altar call or a baptism experience, at which they begin to consider themselves a Christian. And part of that considering themselves a Christian is to develop a conversion narrative. And this would be your testimony. In churchy terms, you develop a testimony. Once you can give a testimony, you have a story of how you became a Christian. And once you have that story in your head, you are definitely a Christian. because you've got a journey that you can tell to that point. So that's a process conversion. Okay. So your disaffiliates, the people who kind of just wander out of church, have they gone through either of those? Probably they have. They may have gone through some form of a process conversion. They're in the church in the first place, right? But the only type of person that sits in the pews and hasn't gone through either of those things is probably a person who's been sitting in the pews since they were in diapers, a person who was raised in the church, a person who was Christian culturally because everyone around them was Christian and their parents were Christian. And so that's sort of a label they adopted for themselves because it was the thing to be. So when you look out into the pews, there's probably about three types of people. There's your converts, there's your seekers, and there's your people who are raised. So you got people auditing the sermon, you got people engaged in the sermon, and you've got people who are just there because they had to be there.
Yeah, one thing that's really helpful, by the way, I'm just going to put in this nugget to hopefully not, we might talk about this later. So I don't want to distract from your current, kind of narrative here, but I'm kind of interested. And I told Caleb in preparation for this discussion that I might raise more questions than I answer in terms of my involvement tonight. But I'm really interested in when you look at, especially, just when you look at the Bible, when you look at how the believing community, whether it be in the Old Testament in that context or in the early church in that context, when there's often this aspect of community, like you see these weird verses, and I'm totally a believer that when you see something weird or strange, that means it's probably kind of important, right? And so you see these phrases that sound really odd to our modern ear. Things like, and I'm not going to be able to quote a specific verse here, but things like, that through mom and dad, that through, like, you should stay together as a husband and wife because, like, that through you, your wife might be saved, or like your child, or like through you, your family would be saved. And you see, this kind of believing community, I guess is just the best word I can think of for it, where it's kind of like there's almost this assumption that if you're born into the community, you have access to special information about the one true God, about Yahweh, about the God of the Hebrews, right? It's like you have information about this God that other people are not necessarily born into the context to have that information. It's kind of like this, if you're born into the believing community, like you have this advantage. And so, again, we can revisit this later, but it's always, or I shouldn't say always, but it's recently posed this question, or brought up this question in my mind of, what does it mean? Like, I just interviewed a guy on one of my podcasts the other day who told this story about, I asked him, he's a business owner. And so the specific context was, what's it like to be a Christian in business? We were talking. And so the first question I asked was for him to give his testimony. And he was like, there was never not a time when I didn't know the Lord. And I thought about that, and I was like, maybe it's true. Like, had I pried a little deeper, maybe he has, as you said, right, gone through one of these particular kind of scenes where you see either, the baptism, or you see some sort of public confession, right? But it just strikes me that there is this category of person who, in a sense, grew up in diapers on a pew. And really, that's me, although I can trace my particular testimony back to a specific Sunday school class one morning when I was 4 years old. But still, there's never a time when I was not within the believing community. Since the time I was born, I was within the believing community. And it strikes me as though there are going to be these people who kind of, these odd, I'm looking at the StreamYard logo and it's a duck. So I'm just going to say these odd ducks who haven't been through what you're calling the crisis conversion. And maybe they are in more of the process conversion. I don't know. But what comes to mind for me is like, well, what does it look like when that kind of person leaves? Like, you wonder, is that going to look more like a deconversion, or is that going to look more like a disaffiliation, or what? So this is just an interesting question that I think is maybe, I don't know, relevant at some point.
Well, when I get into my deconversion model, I think that question is going to be answered for you. But I'd like to briefly touch on the first point that you were raising, which is this idea of the community or the saved husband and wife and so forth. In conversion research, and you be surprised how much there is of that. I read an 800-page book called the Oxford Handbook of Religious Conversion, with hundreds of contributing scholars and researchers, covering everything from historic tribal migrations to neurology. So there's a lot. But at any rate, what you're kind of brushing up against there is a sort of cultural thing. What they've noticed is that in certain cultures, there are cultural conversions where an entire group will move from one type of religion to another, or from irreligion to religion. And this is because they're in sort of a society that's either patriarchal or matriarchal, or has some kind of ruling class, sort of elder group that everybody just sort of follows. And the thing to do there is to persuade the father of the household or the elder group or what have you. And once they convert, everybody just sort of converts along with them. It's a cultural thing. And it's a pretty interesting phenomenon because the entire culture goes through a process conversion, and they go through as a group. And, the Bible was being written to a sort of Middle Eastern culture in the Mediterranean area, and the surrounding cultures as well. So Roman and other cultures in that area. But it was probably a more of a patriarchal society. And you probably did see more of these cultural conversions than you would otherwise. I think you can see evidence of that in the book of Acts, where Paul will enter and a guy's household will get saved, not just the guy. And so, yeah, there's that. And, we did an episode, Caleb and I, where we talked about baptism as a rite of initiation more than an exercise of salvation, because a lot of what being a Christian is being a community. If you are a Christian, you are a part of a community. And so baptism is a classic rite of initiation into a community. If you join a college fraternity, you go through a rite of initiation, probably by hazing. If you go through, if you become what do you call those people with little rings that have the secret handshakes? Mason. You probably go through some kind of initiation. Nothing creepy or disturbing, I'm sure, but
that's a whole another episode. I think we've touched on that before too.
You had a debate, you did, yes. But yeah, and then if you become a Christian, you get dunked. So that's answering that question about communities and conversion.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I totally never thought about it that way. I think it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. So my model of conversion. We talked about deconversion and disaffiliation. Now I'd like to talk about the 5 stages of my process. So the first stage is the setting conditions. And in my field, which is behavioral psychology, setting conditions are very important because we take the position that any decision you make right now is a result of a process of the entire process and history of your life leading up to that decision. Decisions never come out of the blue. They come in the context of your history of learning. And so when we look at a person deconverting, we have to take into account the background that they came out of, because the behavior of deconversion is reliant on all of those things that came from. So what kind of environments do deconverts come out of? They come out of what I have termed a modal typical church. Now, in common phraseology, that would be a fundamentalist church. but fundamentalism is not a term that is very helpful, because everybody's got their own definition of what a fundamentalist is. Basically, it's somebody I don't like that disagrees with me, but that's not helpful when you're doing something technical. So when I was looking through these deconversion narratives, I was honing in and identifying on the common features that every one of these, I can't say everyone, that most of them had in common. And so I identified a number of features, which I then identified as the modes of operation in the background of these churches. And the more of these modes the church had, the more modal typical that church was, if that makes sense. You guys understand my academic ease?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. I'll briefly touch on those modes of operation. I think these deserve their own episode, but what I noticed is that the church backgrounds contained one or more of the following features. One would be performance control. So what I mean by performance control is I mean an environment that the social culture of the environment reinforces and punishes various behaviors. So if I'm a guy who, I don't know, drinks heavily, the environment that I'm in is going to punish that behavior by disapproval, possibly by talking behind my back, possibly by talking right to my face about that, making passive aggressive comments about my drinking, things like that. It's the pastor might coincidentally preach a sermon on how bad drinking is. There's this entire thing where that particular behavior is discouraged by the environment. And then I become part of that environment by, embracing the sermon that the pastor just taught, or by repenting of my drinking to the church. I have then punished that behavior for anybody else who might be doing it. So, the behavior of the entire group punishes certain behaviors like that. They also reward certain behaviors. A person who, I don't know, is a prayer warrior, let's say, is recognized by that. The preacher might be like, and Sally over there, who I know is in her prayer closet every night, they'll point that out. That person will be revered or elevated because of that particular behavior. So those kinds of behaviors are reinforced. Other kinds of behaviors are punished, and the entire community becomes the engine of the reinforcement and punishment of those behaviors. So it's a behavior control. The community controls your behavior. Now, to a degree, that's present in every community, but more so in these particular religious environments. So that's performance control. Any thoughts on that?
None other than I've been there and experienced it. Yeah. I mean, it's, I'm clear on that. I think probably many people listening, can identify with that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So performance control.
I'll just say that, and I think I could probably say this with some of the other factors that'll come up too, but in particular with that one, I know that my faith has been more shaky, particularly when I'm in churches that have a high degree of kind of performance control going on. It's made it more difficult for me to connect with people and to really grow in my faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it kind of, geez, we could camp out the rest of the night here, couldn't we? It kind of...
That's why this deserves its own episode.
Yes, it kind of just misses... it misses everything about grace. It misses everything about what Christ came to do. And that... I'll tell you what it does is I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. I'm going to say it. I'll apologize later, but it bastardizes the Christian experience. In the technical term.
We're all about technical terms here.
Yes. That's what it very technically does. And it makes it to where what you're believing in and what you're serving, and then if you deconvert, ultimately what you're leaving is a mere caricature of the real thing. And I think that's what makes it so painful to watch.
I'd like to come back to that.
Yeah, that's well
but
put.
At the end of my thing, because this is a point that is really well served to end it out. So I'm going to make a note of that. So Okay, and we're back. All right, so performance control, that's the first feature. The second feature would be textualism. Now, textualism is a legal term. And, if you're a constitutional textualist, it means that you follow the letter of the law as closely as possible to its original meaning without trying to read between the lines or reinterpret the meaning for however you want it to be. When I use the term in this context, I'm talking about the way that the scripture is treated and seen. And in textualism, it refers to a situation in which the text is treated as close to perfect as possible. So it is perfect truth from God's lips to your ears, essentially. There are various degrees of textualism. In its most extreme form, it would say that the Bible was a book dictated directly from God, and it was written by God to every single human being who's ever existed in every moment of time in every culture. So that if a little girl from Lithuania were to pick up the Bible and read it in Lithuanian, and then Joe next door were to pick up the Bible and read the King James Version, that they would get the exact same meaning out of it because it is God speaking directly to them from those pages. And so this is an extreme level of value that's placed upon the Bible. Now, I'm not saying that every deconvert came from a church that treated it with that degree of reverence, but at any sense in which, the closer it is to wooden literalism, and not just, infallibility, the closer it is to a perfect degree of textualism. Any thoughts on that?
Just a clarifying question. So this is not synonymous with having a high view of Scripture. This is when someone reads the Bible, it gets so literal and so clear that it's impossible to not read the actual meaning of the words. Is that what you're saying? Like it's textualism such that it might as well be God literally dictating, like we're standing and having a conversation with him, and the words he say mean the same thing to us 2,000 years removed from Christ, 4,000 years removed from the experience of the Hebrews, and that, you see what I'm saying? Like you're saying that across all time, across all cultures, this textualism view says that they'll get the same exact meaning from reading those words. Is that what you're saying?
When I say that, I mean, it's an attitude that says that if let's take the biggest criminal in the court, which is the creation narrative. So you've got the creation narrative, and if it read in plain English from the King James Version, the creation narrative would essentially say that there was this point at which all of reality in terms of matter and energy that we know was produced in stages over a very brief period of time, spoken from the lips of an omnipotent creator, such that for, at one moment there were not hermit crabs, and then a word was spoken and then there were hermit crabs, that kind of thing. And that's what it seems to say. Now, if I were to come back on that and say, well, if you understood the sort of culture that this was being written in, they would have understood what was being said here differently. That would be anathema, because, the Bible wasn't written for one culture. It was written for everybody. And so I need to get the same meaning out of this as an ancient Hebrew would. And to suggest otherwise is to suggest that the Bible wasn't written for everyone. It might have been written by a nomadic guy in, the year 400 BCE, for that group. And if that's the case, then how is this a book of God written to me? You could see how that might cause problems, to suggest that you need to know more about the original languages and culture to actually understood what was being said by God here.
Right. Okay. And so the attitude that says that you don't need that is the attitude that you're expressing with this idea of textualism.
Yeah. The more qualifications you need to place around Scripture in order to understand it in its pure best form, the more you're defying the spirit of contextualism, which says that it is this sort of holy living document that will speak to me.
Understood. Okay, I get it. Perfect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that there is one view of textualism that's all encompassing. I'm saying as you approach this view that the Bible is practically its own deity, you're getting closer to a purist form of textualism. But these churches tend to lean more in that direction than they do in the other direction.
Yeah, as a close friend of mine says, this view would maybe be characterized by, the Godhead is the Father, the Son, and God's holy word kind of thing. Almost worshiping the Bible almost as a entity in itself. Okay, yeah, okay, yeah. I'm on board with you.
Okay. So the next one, and this is probably the key. I think of all of these, this is the one that I see possibly most productive of deconversion, and that would be isolationism. So isolationism is it's a philosophy cultivated by this idea. If you're a parent, you've probably had the idea yourself that there are a lot of very corrupting influences out there in the world, and my kids were watching a show the other day, and it was a Disney cartoon show, and it just happened to be Pride Month. And so this, magical fairy comes on, except he's a dude. But he's got the wig and the lipstick and, the wings, and, in a Bugs Bunny cartoon, that would have been funny because of the context of the time. But the fact that he's wearing the transgender stripes on his tutu kind of indicate that they were going a different direction with that. And, the point being, hey, there's this sort of message that's being delivered to my children through this cartoon that I just happened to walk in on. And maybe I don't like that message, so maybe it would be better not to let them watch those cartoons. And then, you see the news and, all of these sensationalized news stories that the schools are out to get your kids. And so you pull them out of schools and you homeschool them. And then, you're listening to pop music and you don't like the lyrics. And so you take those CDs away and hand them the Christian version of pop music. And, then you get the idea. And the idea is that the more you keep away from these corruptive influences of the quote unquote world around you, the more you're preserving the innocence and, spiritual strength of the individual. And so isolationism is any kind of environment where you're discouraged from interacting with the secular world outside of the church, and you're encouraged to only engage in material that is church approved, and relationships that are church approved. So that's isolationism. It's sort of the ostrich burying its head in the sand philosophy.
And is there if I may raise a quick question on that? Sorry to keep asking questions, but I really want to understand. Are there like levels of, maybe I'm still thinking more like a theologian than a social scientist here.
No, please do. That's why you're here.
Yeah. But like, it occurs to me that there's maybe some merit to some of those things. Like, growing up, certainly there was that isolationist spirit was definitely around me. Although what's interesting is that in my particular context, my mom really didn't. I grew up just basically living with my mom, and she didn't so much enforce that. I listened to stuff that would not be like church approved, or watched stuff that would not be like, church approved, all the time. But at the same time, there was a standard, like a few times. I'm not proud of it, right? But a few times I stayed up late with, doing a call with my buddy on the phone, like watching South Park, right? And like had my mom found that out, she wouldn't have been very happy with me, despite the fact that she was watching it in another room. That's a different story, right? A different part of it. But no doubt, a young boy, like she wouldn't have been too happy with me watching South Park, and yet, Linkin Park was one of my favorite bands, and she never like ripped their music out of my hand. So, I guess it's like, is there varying degrees there, or maybe stepping into the theologian side of it, is some of that permissible? And it's just this extreme version. Is that what you're seeing in your research?
Well, I think this would cycle back a little bit to the performance control. You fostered that, the less controlled the person is by the environment, the more other environments might intrude upon the person to control their behavior. And so if you're in a situation where performance control is part of the milieu, then isolationism is, a key of that performance control. And you'll notice that as I describe these things, they tend to, they tend to toe the line of cultism. In their purest form, everything I'm describing would end up being a cult, correct?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely.
You totally isolate the person. You create an environment where the environment controls their behavior entirely, and then they place a unquestioning reverence upon this book. So far, let's see what other cult themes I can get out of here.
And I find it interesting too. I think, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I think some of it is it safe to say it's perceptual in the eyes of the individual? So they could be going to a church, but because of family influences that create more of that isolationism, it may be something that is being over perceived, even though it may not be a feature of that given church or that denomination or whatever the case may be. Is it safe to say there's some perceptual element there in terms of how they perceive it being isolational?
Well, I think we can see in the nature of the culture now that sometimes isolationism is self-imposed. We have echo chambers. We only speak to people who already agree with us. We avoid those people who disagree with us. The nation, possibly the world, has become one big high school cafeteria where you sit with a clique that, best describes your particular personal identity, and you sit there and talk crap about all the other cliques at the other tables. And so, isolationism isn't necessarily imposed by the environment. It might be self-imposed to a degree. And we do that as adults, but children don't have as much say in that.
Would it be fair to say, too, that maybe the level of isolationism that we're discussing, if we were to kind of try to nail down maybe not a definition of it, but a description of it, would it be that which imposes restrictions beyond what is imposed by the Bible? I mean, surely we can all agree here that what parents should not take away from this, or what anybody should not take away from this, is that it's bad to be separated from the world, right? Because there's that element of separation that we find clearly in the biblical narrative. So would it be fair to say that, okay, so let's say that hypothetically, which it's not very hypothetical, but let's just say it's hypothetical in experiences growing up. Let's say that one wanted to use a Bible verse like avoid all appearances of evil to therefore justify not allowing your children or whatever to go do a particular thing that you considered an appearance of evil, but that's maybe rather subjective, and so it forces upon the child or the teenager or whoever this sense of the isolationism beyond what the Bible would seem to what's the demand of us, right? So like there's obviously going to be this level of that we're different because of a calling, of being called out, the ecclesia, right? There's going to be that, but then anytime we go beyond what Scripture says, we suddenly get into this dangerous ground of isolationism. Is that fair to say?
So in Jewish culture, there's a thing called a Talmudic hedge, and that is this idea that there are certain sacred rules that one has to follow, and in order to follow those rules, you place a hedge around those rules so that you don't even get close to breaking the rules. So, it's not enough to avoid saying God's name inappropriately, we must avoid saying God's name entirely. It's not enough to, make sure you don't go and rake the lawn on Saturday. I'm not even going to leave my bed on Saturday, just in case. And so you place an arm's distance, you social distance from the law that might be broken, and then that hedge itself becomes the law. And so this might be what you're seeing in certain isolationist situations where, I think I might have gone through something like this in my early childhood where there were bad words we were not supposed to say. So instead of saying the bad word, we would say, darn it, or, oh, fudge, or, things like that. But then those words, because they were replacing the bad words, we had to avoid saying those words.
Totally. Yeah.
So, those became cuss words in and of themselves because they were replacements for cuss words. And, so that would be the Talmudic hedge, if that makes sense to you.
It does. It makes total sense. So I think I think then based on that, it's fair to say that what I said is at least somewhat helpful. That once you go beyond what Scripture actually requires of you, you're placing this hedge that is, you call it the Talmudic hedge. We can call it the fundamentalist hedge, whatever you want to call it, right? But it's or this modal typical edge, I don't know. But there certainly seems to be this point at which there's requirements placed upon you that go beyond Scripture, and yet they are touted with the level of authority as Scripture. That's the problem, because Scripture is being used. I'm just trying to make this really practical for people. Scripture is being used to justify now conforming to this hedge by basically taking scriptures that, taking Scripture out of context, right? And kind of taking these broader sounding statements and applying them to the specific things which you dislike, and then making your family or whoever, or your congregation, whatever the context is, have to conform to that. I wanted to spend time clarifying that because you said this is kind of one of the really important points to it. And so I think it makes sense, this just goes back to the fundamentals, like that Scripture, God's command to us is our guide, and to go beyond that is to add to Scripture, which is a no-no. Yeah.
All right. So that was isolationism. The next would be spiritualism. Now, spiritualism I use to describe this sense in which the supernatural elements of Christianity are given some sort of primary importance in the practice and preaching of this particular church. And so, the most obvious forms of spiritualism would be things like, these ecstatic spiritual experiences, convulsing on the floor, speaking in tongues, maybe performing miracles or prophecies in front of the church, that kind of thing where, there's this sort of Spirit of God acting through you type experience. But, another type of spiritualism would be this kind of idea that, there are angels and demons all around me that are manipulating the world in, ways that explain all the bad things that happen. So, I was texting on my phone instead of looking at the road, and then I looked up right in time to swerve out of the way of this car that was coming, and my guardian angel got me. That was my angel who was doing that for me. But of course, it was the demon of texting that was making me text and look away from the road. And so if, say the pastor ends up having a mistress on the side, that was because it infested him, and, he had the demon of adultery and so we just need to cast that demon out of him. And, but then another form of spiritualism would be more like a high church type spiritualism, where you go and you participate in these rituals in order to have these sort of deep experiences that affect you at a spiritual level. So it's this idea that there is a spiritual world, and it's very present upon us. And, that's an important part of my faith, of my belief. I take it you're still with me? Okay.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and say it's one thing that, one of the books I constantly go back to is the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis. because it does such a good job of not only dramatizing and make interesting kind of this spiritual world that's around us, but it does so in such a balanced way that it doesn't put an angel or a demon in every corner of everything. It deals with some of this is psychology, some of this is sociology, some of this is just the way you're hardwired. And it doesn't put any of these things in too much of a place of precedence in a believer's life.
Yep. Yeah, I like the Screw Tape Letters because, even if I didn't believe in demons, it still shows how circumstances work to kind of affect your religious practice. So it has keen social insights, if nothing else. I'm not saying I don't believe in demons, but I'm saying that it works either way. All right, so that's spiritualism. And the last one I have now, this is one that took me so long to get my head around because it was very present in the entire study that I was doing, but it didn't make sense to me. What would happen? Oh, shoot, there's a guy I really want to bring up because he is an atheist magician in the UK who's very...
Darren Brown.
There you go. Thank you. I wanted to bring him up specifically for you, but you had me. Thanks. Appreciate that, bro.
Yep.
But yeah, this was one, I remember him making it. I think he was the first I remember making this objection, but it's this idea that, and I've had atheists throw this at me in discussions, like you Christians think you have the truth. You're so certain that everything you have is the absolute truth. And, you've got the market. And I was like, okay. And then others would be like, and then I left Christianity and I was cast into the sea of, uncertainty. And so eventually I got my head around it, and I call it compulsive certainty. It's this idea that a monotypical church places a high value on confidence and certainty. You have to be certain of your salvation. You have to be certain of the truth of Scripture. You have to be certain that the words the preacher is saying are, the truth, and so on and so forth. And so, any movement away from certainty towards uncertainty is unbiblical and inconsistent with a religion, such that the very act of doubting is evidence against that religion, because you're taking something that should be certain to you and you're placing it into a status of a holding state. Now you're uncertain. You have questions of its truth value and its certainty, and you shouldn't be having those if it was the absolute truth. So I call it compulsive certainty. Any thoughts on that?
I don't think I necessarily have an issue with it. I did get into an interesting discussion the other day with basically somebody who thought that if you don't have certainty, you can't really say that you know something. And I wasn't, I was using all the analogies I could possibly think of, right? The difference between, doubting whether or not a pilot can get you across the Atlantic, versus actually hopping in the plane, and you know what I mean? But like, for some reason, nothing was getting through. I mean, they basically were just like, no, that's absurd. Like, if you have doubts about it, then you don't really believe it. And I'm just like, well, no, that doesn't seem accurate to me. I mean, it seems to me that you can feel uneasy about something because you don't have total certainty that the situation is going to come out, while still having a high degree of confidence that, the outcome, you don't actually believe that you're not going to make it across the Atlantic, else I would hopefully not get on the plane. And yet, it's like, I want to go to Israel one day. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, to get to Israel, I'm going to have to get on the plane. And I would like to think that I have enough confidence, right, in the pilot that I'm actually going to get on the plane whenever that happens, and I'm going to go. But I'm probably going to be scared the whole time that I'll end up in the ocean before I get there. And this is just because I have this, fear of flying. So I don't necessarily think I have anything meaningful to contribute there, other than just to say, like, it just seems obvious to me that certainty is not required in order to feel pretty confident that you know something or have belief in something. And yet I think it's a very common thing. I mean, the gentleman that I was discussing, I work with him. He's a smart dude. I mean, he's no slouch intellectually. And I'm just like, how is this connection not being made?
Mm-hmm.
So with that compulsive certainty, is it strictly, did you find it strictly in regards to salvific issues, or was it compulsive certainty about a variety of things within the church?
So it's this idea that to be Christian is to have all of the answers. And so you'll notice this, this is a tactic, or I call it a machine gun tactic, that is used by atheists sometimes, that they'll throw out well, what about evolution? And you answer that, and they'll be like, well, what about babies suffering in hell? Well, what about this? What about that? And, the idea is that you're supposed to have an answer to every single one of these questions. And if you don't have an answer to every question that comes at you, then it must be untrue. So, this compulsive certainty, it's this idea that we have to have answers. It eliminates any possibility of I don't know being the answer. You can't say I don't know, because if you don't know, then what assurance do you have that what you have is the truth? You have to know. And it's also the idea that I lost my train of thought on that one, but yeah. So compulsive certainty.
And that's bothersome, because I don't know is sometimes the best answer when you're having a personal conversation with somebody over something deep and meaningful. If you just spit something out, it's going to come off as disingenuous and arrogant a lot of the times, versus saying I don't know and continuing this conversation at a later time.
Yeah, I used to be a cell phone salesman, and people would come up and say, well, why is my phone doing this? And I would say maybe about 60% of the time I didn't know, or they were asking about a plan or a service and I didn't know the answer. But because I'm the salesperson wearing the name tag of the company standing in front of them, I had to pretend that I did know. So I would just kind of like throw a word salad at them, or, make some stuff up, and just to make sure that, they still considered me the knowledgeable representative of the company and not a guy in a uniform who doesn't know what he's talking about, which is what I actually was. And that's, as a representative of Christianity, that's an underlying instinct sometimes that you have, is to just sort of start, saying things and hoping that the things you say and the words you put in order make sense to that person, such that they stop asking the stupid question. Because you can't say, I don't know. Because that would be evidence that maybe you're wrong.
I can get that feeling.
Yeah. All right. So compulsive certainty. And that was the last of the modes associated with modal typical churches. I'm ready to move on to the next stage if y'all are. Okay. So that was setting conditions. Anybody could come from that kind of background. But if you're the type of person who used to be Christian and now calls yourself an atheist, you definitely came from some version of those setting conditions. And so now the next stage is what I've called stressors. Now, life is stressful. Everybody's going to go through stress. But there are certain types of stressors, the accumulation of which can eventually prime you for deconversion. And the stressors typically relate to the settings, conditions that I just went over. So, for instance, performance control was one of the things that I mentioned. One of these things that you see a lot in the deconversion cases is that they say, I had all of these. Well, okay, so what was it? Josh Brolin, the guy who did the I Kiss Dating Goodbye thing. Yeah, it doesn't matter. You know who I'm talking about. He deconverted.
It was Joshua Harris. Joshua
Harris. Right. He deconverted not too long ago. And what he had done was to place a Talmudic hedge around the idea of dating and relationships, and to develop this sort of intricate system of performance you'd have to go through in order to eventually find a girl and marry her. And so this constant having to restrain your behaviors and watch your own back and, follow a complex series of rituals to avoid doing a thing that might be wrong, and then punishing yourself mentally when you did do something wrong, serves as a stressor. And it's a stressor that desires relief. At some point it becomes unlivable to have to constantly abide by these rules and question your own performance and, your own quality as a person for not being able to live with it, function within the system in the way that you behave and the desires that you have. So that would be a stressor. And related stressors would be things like relationship problems. If you have some marital problems and you're a Christian who is strongly set against things like divorce and believes that God kind of intervenes in your marriage and things like that, it becomes inconsistent with what you believe to be going through a marital problem like that. And certainly inconsistent with what you believe if you end up at the point of divorce. So this is a stressor related to performance control. Textualism. Stressors related to textualism would be any kind of doubt that you have about the perfection and consistency of Scripture. So, for instance, if I begin to have questions about whether Jonah really could have survived in the belly of a great fish, or indeed if there was a fish that could swallow a man like that, this becomes problematic because, what if the text isn't absolutely perfect? If there are historical problems with Scripture. So, for instance, Bart Ehrman famously talks about how he had this problem resolving a historical issue with Scripture about the high priest at the time of Jesus' birth or something like that. And so, this was a stressor because he had such a high value of Scripture. So, yeah, there's a number of, and we deal with those every day as apologists. So, yeah.
Is it fair to say that a stressor is anything that creates cognitive dissonance between what you used to believe and kind of new beliefs that are like forming as a result of the stressor?
Cognitive dissonance is one of the strong stressors. I would say that cognitive dissonance, in the sense that your beliefs or practices are inconsistent with experiences that you're having, and also life stressors like marital problems or loss of a job or death of a loved one or things like that. All of these are stressors. Stressors are any kind of life situation, any experience which is inconsistent with your worldview. And I'm going down the list of setting conditions because stressors frequently relate to the setting conditions. So isolationism, this is one I wanted to talk to you about based on a question that you had. So you're isolated within a Christian community. And then you exit the Christian community, or you increase your contact with a non-Christian community. Suddenly you're exposed to ideas that you had no exposure to before, because of the isolated nature of the religion. So, you discover the Beatles music and you start to listen to that, under your covers at 2 a.m. without your mom hearing you because it's really cool. And then you hear Imagine by John Lennon and it's inconsistent with the values that you have. And, things like that. And, you might take that as a joke, but some of these guys actually cited, coming in contact with secular music and actually liking it and realizing that, non-churchy things could be enjoyable as stressors that, accumulated towards the deconversion event. And so, the isolation, but especially when you come in contact with secular values. And this is a study that I read, the Perez Valerie's model, stress this idea where you have a person who's come from a very restrictive religious environment, and then they enter an environment that is not a religious environment, like college, for instance, and suddenly they're exposed to a bunch of ideas and values that they didn't have access to before. You see this with evolution a lot, and here's how that works. Somebody who is a creationist, living in the church, in the echo chamber of the church, everything they know about evolution typically will come to them from Answers in Genesis, or some other creationist organization. And that organization will say, evolutionists say this, and this is why that doesn't work. Well, we all know what that is. That's a straw man. You know, they've told you what evolutionists say, and then they've told you why that's incorrect. And then you actually go and you encounter an evolutionist and you talk to them, and it starts making a lot more sense than it did back in church when Ken Ham was telling you what evolutionists say. And so now that, you've come into contact with ideas you didn't have access to before because of the isolationist situation. I've described this to Caleb in one of our previous podcasts as, let's say you were to live in a house with a OCD mom who kept everything highly sanitized and fed you non-allergenic foods and, avoided vaccination because of all the risks associated therewith. And, wouldn't you let you out of the hermetically sealed door, and you grew up to about 16, and then you exited the house having had no challenges to your immune system whatsoever for that entire period of time, and you entered the world outside of your door. Now you're going to come into contact with various biological toxins and so forth that you had never had access to before, and you're going to be a very sick person because your immune system never had the opportunity to interact with those things. It's very similar when you come from an isolationist environment and then you enter the wider world, and your immune system, as it were, never had the opportunity to interact with those ideas prior to exiting the hermetically sealed religious environment that you came out of. And so that becomes a stressor because now you go through system shock. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. No, I'm trying to determine whether or not I have a question. I may have a question, but it might go on, it might go too on too far of a tangent. I mean, you mentioned the a couple times now, and I get it, the creation issue. And so that's maybe a specific example where, like, I certainly agree that you have those things where it's like this claim was made and it's not like it's there's this caricature of what, say, an evolutionist believes, and then you go talk to the evolutionist and it's like, no, he actually believes something different than that. But I guess it's still possible that that what is, like, the verse in Proverbs where it's like, if you hear a matter, and then it's like you got to give the other guy a chance to respond, or else it's not going to come back. So you might be in the context where, like, you hear Ken Ham say something, and I mean, let's, whatever your thoughts are on him, right? It's like, okay, he says this thing. You go talk to the evolutionist, and it's like, okay, well, he's not. So he says this thing, and now, so there seems to be, in what you're describing, this thought that, well, the evolutionist is the one who actually believes this in his worldview, so he must be right. But it doesn't seem to me that that's necessarily true, even if that's the perception. Let's say that the evolutionist says that, and me, so I'm friends with, for example, geneticists who are young Earth creationists who are, I have every reason to believe, wanting to honestly represent what evolutionists believe, and then honestly, come back with what they've researched on their own, right? So they might take what the evolutionist says, and then they might actually have a meaningful response to that. But then, in the mind of the pending, or the future potentially deconvert, is there more weight on what the evolutionist says? Because like, a perfect example is the recent thing with Rhett and Link. So one of my friends, who is a young Earth creationist geneticist, really great guy, wrote a response to this, and it was really, I thought he did a great job in the response, just in terms of relating to him. Like, he's a personal fan of Rhett and Link, so he really loved that. But he had responses that were you, I mean, in terms of what I know about science, I mean, they sounded just as scientifically plausible to me as, if not more, than maybe what the evolutionists had convinced Rhett and Link of that were true, right? So there's this back and forth. So now it's like, how do I know what to believe? Is that part of the equation too? Like it just this confusion around, I don't know who to trust anymore. Maybe that contributes to it. I know this maybe isn't very helpful, but
well, you're jumping ahead to a stage. So,
okay.
But yeah, I'd like to talk about Rhett and Link for a moment since you brought that up, because as you're talking about this, the obvious example that I could think of is, if you listen to their deconversion narrative, he went into a great deal of detail about his journey in, away from creationism based on all of the evidence that he studied about evolution. And one of the things that you'll find, that you see in that story is that this guy did his research. I mean, he sat down, he read a lot of books. He started talking it out. He started going through it and analyzing it and things like that. He didn't just, read The God Delusion and see what Richard Dawkins' idea of biology was and then walk away. He actually put a lot of work into it. And this is something that deconversion researchers have noticed, is that Christian education may itself contribute to the deconversion process only insofar as the Christian education places a high value on honesty and truth seeking. And so if you begin to doubt something that you've been taught, your Christian education has programmed you to be uncomfortable with just letting that sit there and not investigating it, because the pursuit of truth is the highest thing, And so this idea of the truth, placing value upon truth and honesty, kind of overcomes that sort of cognitive dissonance and pushing things aside, the habit that, some Christians who haven't been through as rigorous an education process, those who have, really do the investigation because they value being right and, being honest. And you kind of see that in the deconversion narrative of Rhett and Link, which is interesting to me. But no, I mean, the short answer to your point is that no, I mean, they start having a conversation with an actual evolutionist and it starts sounding more convincing than it did before. And that's it.
Fair enough.
I'm not saying everybody goes through that has that conversation. Obviously, people, end up remaining creationists, but others don't.
Yeah, right.
All right. So that would be the isolationism, stressors related to spiritualism. This is when prayers don't work. Everybody gathered around the cancerous church member. They put their hands on her. They anointed her with oil. Everybody prayed, and she died anyway. But yesterday I prayed that I'd find a parking spot at the mall, and I did. So, and it's this meme you see where there's the starving kid in Africa, and oh, you prayed for that promotion and you got it, but this kid, but it's more than that. It's the idea that, as you look at things like speaking in tongues and prophecies and faith healings and things like that, a lot of it begins to look artificial. And in certain cases, you can actually drag somebody out who was actually doing this as a sham. And so the less plausible the spiritual realm appears, and the more you move towards sort of a scientific view of reality, the more of a cognitive dissonance this causes. Like, well, how real is the spiritual world that I have placed such value upon? And if as the spiritual world kind of recedes, as I begin to gain a better understanding of how things work in the world around me, the less likely my religious belief becomes, because that spiritualism was very important to it. And if I could explain these sort of exultant spiritual experiences that I have in terms of, hormones and psychology, then the need for a God becomes less relevant at that point. So that's another stressor related to these setting conditions. And then, of course, go ahead, spiritualism.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say real quick, it'd be interesting to do a sub-study of exclusively magicians who have deconverted, because there's a good handful, and I wonder how many of them that specific aspect plays a major piece of it. I know it does for Darren Brown, but I'd be very interested to see that in particular. Maybe I'll follow your research guidelines.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, I can't tell you how many magicians I've run across who made it their sort of hobby of debunking the supernatural and the paranormal and things like that as sort of the hobby. And it's this, once you begin to realize how people can be misled through various illusions and misdirections and so forth, you start to realize how fragile the human mind is in terms of belief formation, and when you make it your professional job to, manipulate their belief formations in order to get them to see things that aren't there, then it becomes more apparent how the world actually works. This is the process I'm talking about. Your eyes are open to, whoa, people operate this way and not that way. And that's a.
It occurs to me. It occurs to me, Caleb, there's probably an adjacent study that can be done about people with maybe new age beliefs, self-help stuff, even, to some degree, marketing. I mean, that's what I do. I'm, marketing guy, and, there's persuasion tactics that, you can just about get people, if you use the right words and the right tactics, you could just about get people to do whatever you want to. And so you certainly wonder, and as somebody who does that, not who does, unethical things. That's not what I mean. But as somebody who is in that world, you kind of like, as you're watching the pastor preach, sometimes you can see some of these tactics happening. And so you begin to wonder, well, are they doing that because that's how they learned to do it? That's how they saw other people do it. Is there a good motive there that, you're using a tactic that, can motivate somebody to take action, but is it actually an ethical thing because that if they take the action, it will produce the result for them that brings them closer to Christ? Anyway, just, that's another interesting kind of angle that somebody could go down.
It is, again, another topic for, a whole show discussion wise on the ethics of those sort of things.
Well, yeah, touching on that just a bit, in the model of conversion that I talked about, I said that the person becomes a seeker because they're looking to resolve something in their life, and one of the things pointed out by conversion researchers is that sometimes the Christian is the one that creates that imbalance in the life that they're looking for a solution. So it's a salesman tactic. You create the need and then sell the product to fulfill that need. If you look at how we present the gospel, that's kind of the thing. We are in a state of separation from God. We would like to be connected with God, and there happens to be a way to do that. But of course, first you have to sell the person on the concept that, hey, we're in separation from God. And I happen to think that that's true, but, evangelism has that sort of salesmanship thing built into it.
Yeah. If I may, a way of thinking about that just very briefly, I think of Greg Koukls, The Story of Reality. And as you study marketing, story driven and story-based marketing, that's all the rage these days. And it has been for a long time. Stories sell. And so whereas some people take the tactic of saying, oh, well, these, because you can persuade this way, it is therefore less likely that something like Christianity is true. I think there's an opportunity for people who live in this world and understand those kind of concepts to take the other tactic and say, no, it's because the story's real, because the story that speaks to us and often works to sell us because it's the story that we're living in the middle of. It's another version of that. And so I think there's a way to put a very positive spin on it towards the gospel. And so that's how I try to present it, in that, when that kind of discussion comes up, I present it as kind of like, that longing. It's kind of like C.S. Lewis said, if I find in myself, a desire for something beyond this world, then the only logical explanation is that there is something beyond this world. So I think that it need not be something that draws people away. It could be something that very much speaks to actual reality.
Yeah. All right. So I have just finished the stressor portion of the model. So the next portion of the model is the trigger. So what you'll notice, and this is a good time to be talking about the subject because we've been hit bam, bam, bam over the last year or two with all of these high profile individuals who have come out and said that they deconverted. And, people who travel in our fields tend to dig into those stories that they tell, the articles and blogs that they write about them and the Facebook posts and Instagram posts and stuff that they make to try to say, okay, what happened to this person? And, in all of these cases, you'll see something like, I don't know, Rhett and Link moved out to California and then they lost their faith. This would be a number of years ago now, but the creator of Rachel Slick, Matt Slick's daughter, grew up with an apologist as a father, and then she deconverted and wrote an article about it. And, in the article, it says that she's having a conversation one day with a friend, and she says, well, if God is never changing, how come the moral law has changed so greatly from the Old Testament to the New Testament? And then he can't answer, and she can't answer, and then she deconverts. And so, what you'll notice is that in each of these cases, there's this very obvious question or event that occurs that is followed by this whole, and then I deconverted kind of thing. And people in our position who are apologists then tend to write blog responses and do podcast responses and so forth to the event that, precipitated the deconversion. And this is what I call the trigger. Now, if you've been paying attention to my presentation up to this point, you'll realize along with me that the trigger had very little to do with the actual deconversion. The trigger was just the culmination of a series of stressors that primed the person for deconversion. And so how I describe the trigger event is that event which removes which gives the person intellectual permission to start exploring their doubts, to start questioning their beliefs. They have had a series of stressors leading up to this point, but there's this taboo against entertaining these doubts and difficulties. You must not do that because beyond that point lies monsters. And then something occurs in your life which gives you intellectual permission to start to explore those questions that you've had. And once that happens, the floodgates open and all of these things that you've been kind of pushing to the back because you're not allowed by your worldview to entertain them, come forward, and then you begin the deconversion process. So, again, the trigger doesn't necessarily have to be anything remarkable. It's just the straw that broke the camel's back. It's that last thing it's the needle that popped the balloon that was already over full. Make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Quick analogy. For me, it looks like you can apply this to other things. Like, for me, I used to weigh 280 pounds, and my whole life I was always really, really heavy. But there was always this thing of like, the way you lose weight is to go kick your butt, get off your lazy butt and go get on a treadmill and eat rabbit food. And it's like, I had this worldview supposition that that's what I had to do. And every time I tried to do that, I failed. And I never moved beyond that. And then one day I got on a roller coaster, or at least try to, and I hate roller coasters. I just wanted to impress my wife. So I got on the roller coaster and I didn't fit. The thing was too, right? So there was, boom, I've described that before as my trigger. Bam. There was my moment where I was now like intellectually, I was like, my circumstances made a decision for me. And that's not cool. I can no longer make my own decisions. And so then I gave myself permission and this is not dietary advice, right? There's a disclaimer. Gave myself permission to explore other options, looked into keto, lost 60 plus pounds, and here we are today. Like, my life is entirely different. So I think that might be a helpful analogy of what the trigger moment is. It's just that one moment that kind of snaps the light switch.
Yeah, another analogy for it would be state change in matter. So you have, if you've studied chemistry, you know that water, you bring it to a boil and it's primed for conversion into gas, from liquid into gas, but then there's that incremental degree that becomes the state change that then converts it into the gas. So, but anyway, the point is made that, an event occurs and that person tips over the edge from, suppressing, pushing back all of these stressors to exploring them. And then they begin the process, which is the next stage of my model. So process tends to either go in the direction of, here's the pop term that, if you ever follow atheists that deconvert, and there's whole podcast shows and YouTube channels devoted to just people telling their deconversion stories. Also whole websites and blogs and quote unquote ministries and so forth. It's a big deal. And I listen to a lot of those. But the pop term used is deconstruction. In fact, they'll use this term in place of deconversion. I didn't deconvert, I deconstructed, kind of thing. So in pop atheist terms, this would be the deconstruction period. But I use deconstruction in a technical sense. And here's what I mean. Either you make a rescue attempt or you deconstruct. The difference is that when you're making a rescue attempt, you really don't want to deconvert. You deeply and sincerely desire for Christianity to be true and to kind of rescue your belief. When you make a rescue attempt, you're going to be one of two types of people. You're going to either try to rescue the content of your beliefs, or you're just going to try to rescue the belief. If you're going to try to rescue content, then this is when you start to engage in things like apologetics. You can't possibly allow yourself to believe in evolution, because to cross that line would mean that God doesn't exist. Evolution, therefore not God. And so you must study everything you can, like Rhett did, against evolution, and try to, rescue that particular idea that you have, because to release that one idea would be to release all of your faith. And so that's content rescue. The other type of rescue would be belief rescue. Now, with belief rescue, you're willing to make compromises. Evolution now seems very much true to you. So you're like, well, I could still be a Christian and also believe in evolution. So you do that. And then you encounter a historical error in the Bible, like Bart Ehrman did. And Ehrman, he made this move to more of a theologically liberal position, where he dropped his, he didn't have a high textualism, he had a low textualism, and he would allow for various mistakes and scribal errors and things to creep into the Bible over time. But, God still exists, kind of thing. So you start attending a different church. And then, of course, there's the social issues, like, the role of women in the church, or the treatment of homosexuals and things like that. When you become convinced that this is wrong, then all you have to do is take a shimmy to the left, and that ceases to become a problem, because you now find a church that allows for this objection that you have. And this is what I've called leftward drift, because we've already talked about how these people tend to come from fundamentalist churches, which are about as right-wing as you can get in the religious sphere. And a lot of the objections that I've just named tend to disappear if you shimmy a little bit to the left. And so what happens with this leftward drift is typically they take a step to the left because of one of the objections that I just discussed. And then as they shift to the left, their values begin to shift with them. And as their values begin to shift, they start to have value objections with Christianity. And so in order to compensate for those value objections, they have to move further to the left. And, it becomes a self-perpetuating process where they continue to move to the left to escape these increasingly aversive ideas that they had in church. And after you get to a certain point, you discard religion altogether. And so those are the two types of rescue. You've got content rescue, and content rescue falls apart when you realize that one of the things that you've believed can't be true. And because you have a house of cards, if one thing can't be true, none of it can be true. And then the leftward drift falls apart at the point when you realize that you really don't need religion at all as your worldview is adjusting. And so, and religion itself is problematic because of political reasons and things like that, as you begin to move more from the religious to the political. So that is the rescue version of deconversion. Any questions about that? No? Okay. All right. So the other type of deconversion would be deconstruction proper. And deconstruction proper is an instance in which you actually are attempting to overcome the religious ideas that you have because you have this, because religion itself has become kind of unpleasant or aversive. And so you're in this, in the process of attempting to debunk the beliefs that you've held in order to move beyond them. And so whereas rescue is attempting to rescue those beliefs, deconstruction is attempting to tear down those beliefs. So you take the, this is a description that more or less verbatim from one of these deconverts. You lay out all the things that you believe on the table and you begin to pick them up and inspect them. And you inspect them and you discard them as you inspect them. And you try to reconfigure this worldview that you've had on the table all spread out in pieces. And you start discarding pieces as they no longer fit. And eventually the whole thing's gone. Now that's one of many analogies. I've heard an analogy of draining the pool, of removing bricks from a wall, but it's all the same idea. You take ideas, you start to discard them, and after a certain point, you've discarded enough that the whole system falls apart. And that's deconstruction. So that is the process part of my model. Any questions about that? No? All right. So that moves us to the, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I will just jump in and say this, given the early parts of this process compared to when we get to this actual process part, you really wonder how many people are kind of actively in this stage in some way. I mean, I even think of apologists because, most of us that I've talked to have come out of kind of these same kind of backgrounds and church beliefs growing up and, have reached this process part, if you will, where we really begin to investigate, why we believe what we do. So I don't know. It's kind of an unfinished
this
thought,
is a thought that I've had as well, because as I go through and study all of these deconversions, I am beginning the process by finding a person who is now an atheist and asking them how they became an atheist. And so it's easy to, look at this model and say that, it's a railroad right towards atheism. But this ignores the fact that there are very likely many people who have gotten to some stage down this particular process and managed to not deconvert in the end. They had a successful rescue, for instance, or they aborted the process at some point. So yeah, it's very likely that there are lots of people who progress down this avenue without actually reaching the termination point. But I haven't studied those.
Fair enough.
One example might be Sean McDowell, because he frequently talks about how he, began having doubts and etc. And he was encouraged by his father to actually explore those doubts and come to his own conclusions. And so he did, and eventually he came to the conclusion that, Christianity was indeed true. So he might be an example of somebody who was an abortive deconvert. He almost, but then didn't. So it's entirely possible that this model isn't a terminal model. You don't have a terminal disease if you enter one of these stages. You might still end up remaining Christian at the end.
I think that's an important point.
Yeah, as I've studied this process, I keep going, whoa, I have exactly this particular set of qualities. I have the same background. I've got the profile of deconvert. Wonder what's happening in my future.
I hear you.
Yeah, but so this brings us to the final part, which is the deconversion proper. Now, I mean, you could ride the railroad up to this point and say, okay, and then he deconverts the end. But no, I mean, there's more to the actual deconversion stage, because at some point you've got to go from saying, hey, everybody, I'm a Christian, to, hey, everybody, I'm an atheist. Actually taking the stage of adopting that label is a process in and of itself. And so, you have people who remain in the church for years, no longer believing, but unable to leave the environment. I've heard several of these testimonies of a pastor who's like up in, talking about how he's up in the pulpit every Sunday, feeling super guilty because he doesn't believe a thing that he's saying, but, it's his job and people are depending on him. So he's got to get up there and preach something. These are several of the cases I studied. In fact, there's a whole entire ex-pastor ministry out there. This is part of the deconversion thing that I ought to talk about, is that your most vocal deconverts are also the people who are most active in their church. Their identities were very closely tied to being Christian. If you had them list on a piece of paper the top 5 things they used to identify themselves, Christianity would be probably number 1 on that list, if not at least in the top 5. These are people who were Christian leaders. These were people who, really desired to lead in ministry. All of these people, I can't say all, many of these people, something like 67% of the ones I studied had gone to a Christian college or seminary with the idea of doing some kind of ministry work down the road. So these are heavily invested people. And then, they deconvert. And this, because they were so invested, their identity was so invested in the church, this was a big problem for them. Because now, who am I if I am not a Christian? I am something else. And I have to go through this identity crisis of redefining who I am. And this is problematic because I am so heavily invested in Christianity, this is my community. All of my friends and family are Christians. All of the people to whom I am closest, the people who support me, who love me, and, who desire my advice and things, are all Christians. But I no longer believe any of that stuff. And so this is a huge process. This is what I call the deconversion crisis, because it is a crisis. And if you listen to these, testimonies that I interacted with heavily, I don't think I've had one yet where the person wasn't super stressed and, traumatized by this deconversion experience. Now, they'll come back and say that their entire religious experience was traumatizing to them. It may or may not be, but the deconversion process definitely was, because they have to reform their own identity. And then they lose their community. They lose their family. They lose their friends. And, as human beings, we have this need for community. We have a need for belonging. And suddenly they're a person who does not belong. And so, there's this part of the deconversion process is trying to find a new community to replace your Christian community. And then there's the problem of not just your identity crisis personally, but the community's identity crisis. Because suddenly you go from being a person who was a recognized Christian within the community to a person who is now saying that Christianity is false, that you no longer believe these things. And now your community has to redefine their identity of you. They have to start identifying you as not one of us, but one of them. You've become the enemy. You've moved to the dark side, and so forth. And so that's traumatizing. So the deconversion experience at the very end, when you would adopt or accept the identity of atheist, you go through hell as a result of this. There is a thing called religious trauma syndrome, RTS, which I have heard about a great deal from my interaction with these deconversion narratives. And like there's whole professional counselors that make their career about just treating religious trauma syndrome. There's helplines that you could call if you're suffering from religious trauma syndrome. There's textbooks that have been written on religious trauma syndrome. So it's a thing. Now, I mean, you could say that this religious trauma is all coming from the deconversion experience, but they will say that the church itself is a highly abusive environment. And this is where you get this objection that you frequently see from the atheist side that, raising your kids to be Christian is child abuse. You're indoctrinating them. You're stripping them of their free will. And then, of course, I've encountered, unfortunately, a number of situations where a person was sexually abused within the church, and they credit that as part of their deconversion. Of course, why wouldn't you at that instance? But a lot of this dirty laundry tends to surface at that point, and the question is how much of this accurately reflects the church as an environment. Well, that's a complicated question because I have no doubt that there are many, many churches out there that present an abusive environment. And the reason is that a church is a good scenario to start grooming people for abuse. If you control the person's ideology at a spiritual level, you've put yourself in a position where you can have a great deal of control over these people. And this is why cults tend to develop out of churches. Nice little Christian churches will turn into cults. Unfortunately, it happens. And this is why child abusers, pedophiles will seek out positions as Sunday school teachers, because it puts them in a position where they have access to children and they are able to group children. So unfortunately, the church forms an environment where these kinds of abuses can take place. Now, is that endemic to Christianity? No, I think Christianity, or at least religion itself, creates an environment that allows abusers to take advantage of it. I don't think that indicts the system. I think it talks about the structure.
That's actually a really great point that I've never thought of, but I think it's very helpful to have this this perspective. Of course, you're going to have those who claim, oh, well, Joel's just biased because he's a Christian apologist who's trying to, whatever. I'm sure you're going to have those people say that. But, we know how to deal with those kind of objections. But it is interesting, though, that if you look at it from this perspective, like, it's okay to admit, okay, I'm a marketing guy, right? So in a marketing environment, you have those like network marketing, right? Is network marketing MLM type stuff endemically, or that was a big word you used that maybe I'm using it right. But inherently, intrinsically evil. No, it's a form of marketing, but it is an environment which is very conducive to being able to take advantage of people, because you have the rah kind of thing. You got the group mentality, the hive mind kind of thing, where it's like you're all trying to pump each other up kind of thing. And you have people who will seriously take advantage. I mean, that's why they have what are called pyramid schemes. An MLM is not necessarily a pyramid scheme, which, okay, that's debatable, right? But let's just say, technically speaking, a pyramid scheme is not synonymous with the concept of network marketing, but certainly that environment is conducive to creating pyramid schemes. So maybe that's an analogy that's somewhat helpful, but I do think that it's very important to be able to admit, because some people, I think, will, because they have an understanding of what Christianity truly is and truly means, some people will be very hesitant to even admit what you just said, that religion in general does create this environment that's conducive to manipulation. And I think it's very important to have voices inside the church who are standing up and very specifically saying, yes, we get that. As people in the church, we get that, and we're speaking out heavily against this practice and heavily against the use of this environment for this purpose, because it's not the way it was intended to be. Yeah, that's good.
So in the scientific community, we have peer review, right? Which is the process by which the science is self-correcting. You have a community of peers, and they analyze, your research and check it in order to make sure that you're not crafting anything incorrect. And then, one of the things that PhD students are encouraged to do is to go back and perform experiments that were done before in published papers to check the work. So I could actually publish a paper. I could make my thesis or do my doctorate on some research that's already been done and check their results and, publish it. So, and this is something that's encouraged to be done. And I think the church should be a place similar to that, insofar as it should be an open community where individuals are allowed to correct one another. I should have a voice to be able to speak up and call somebody out for things that individuals within the church should not be part of a hierarchy. We are all on the same level playing field, and we should be allowed to have the ability to talk to one another and to call things out when we see them. And this authoritarianism that one sees in certain churches, where you're not allowed to question the pastor or the elders or so forth, reeks of this kind of compulsive certainty that you need to have. There must be no questions in this environment. In my perfect church, it would be an open forum, and disagreements would be encouraged, because you said this yourself when we were talking about the creation versus evolution debate. The best form of that debate would be to hear both sides of it, so that you don't have any straw men. You come away with the strongest version of both sides. And so if I am in the church, and the church, teaches that Genesis 1 must be seen this way, I would not back down at any case from allowing the other side to come in and present their case. If I'm in a church that believes in a rapture and somebody doesn't believe in a rapture, have those two people discuss it, put it in in the strongest terms, because in an open market of ideas, in the marketplace of ideas are strongest when they're allowed to compete against one another, and ideas are weakest when, we're not even allowed to look at the other side or see the other ideas. So that's that. That's my
idea. Yeah, and I'm not going to go down this road deep, but with a lot of contemporary issues, we're seeing that's one of the problems with critical theory, and why it is so dangerous is it limits the amount of ideas that are there, and it limits the ones that have value. So I agree. If you limit things in that kind of way, you're asking for trouble.
Yeah, there's a sort of isolationism or hyper-tribalism kind of built into that system itself. We kind of see that happening in the world at large. I already made this point that the world is one big high school cafeteria, and we're all in our cliques, isolating ourselves into these echo chambers. But again, that's a point that's already been made. So yeah, now let me briefly talk about deconversion narrative. One of the things in my studies on conversion, one of the things I've already mentioned to you, is that you form this testimony. You have this narrative. And this is this idea that as I look back along my life, I can see all of the circumstances that brought me up to my salvation, my Christian walk that I'm in now. And I could go there and I could tell you exactly how God got me from point A to point B. I can give my testimony. I have a conversion narrative. And the same or a similar thing happens when you deconvert. You now have a deconversion narrative, meaning you go back and you look along your religious life and you can identify all of the things that led you to believe these false ideas. that led you to behave in these false ways, and how these accumulated stressors opened your eyes to the light of reason and to the deceptions that were put upon you. And this is interesting because, if I were to grab this deconvert in a moment in time when they were Christian and they were, having this praise and worship experience and they were feeling particularly spiritual at the moment, how they described that moment to me as they're experiencing it would be a great deal different than how they would describe that same moment to me years later as an atheist, looking back on it. They have to re-explain all of those experiences, even the positive ones, in a way that explains why they felt that way then and they feel this way now. And so what you have when you talk to deconverts is that they tend to see Christians not as mistaken, but as manipulative liars. I'm deceptive, I'm not merely mistaken. Because in their deconversion narrative, their entire Christian history was a history of being deceived and taken advantage of. And so they rewrite their narrative, their life narrative, now to reflect their new beliefs and values. And I have to wonder how much of this religious trauma syndrome comes from this act of creating a deconversion narrative. This is not me dismissing any abuses the church may heap upon people. I'm perfectly willing to admit that kind of thing does unfortunately happen. But one wonders how much exaggerated those might become when one forms one's deconversion narrative.
Well, everybody wants to tell better stories. So yeah, I mean, without ascribing, motive to somebody, I mean, it's kind of hard not to do that and you psychoanalyze them or whatever. But like, definitely you can kind of see where they might add in some hyperbole. Again, not to delegitimize the actual experiences that happened, but there might be some hyperbole there, especially maybe an inability to see people or to ascribe to others a positive motive. Maybe these people aren't actually liars. They just, are, mistaken or something. But you certainly see this hostility towards like somebody, I can't imagine, there are people right now in the world who look at me and they would call me a liar. And yet the reason I promote this stuff is because I believe it, right? I'm sold, right? Like Christ sold me on himself. Like I bought in, hook, line, and sinker because I believe it's true. But yet they would look at me and say, "Oh, he's a liar." So I guess the question is, from that perspective, is it something where they talk themselves into believing that? Is it just they're trying to talk other people into thinking that's how it is for the sake of telling a better story? These are questions that you just kind of have to think through when you're, evaluating people's testimonies and their claims.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and from my study of looking at the various psychological factors that go into decisions and how people generate their own perception of things. There's a lot of factors that it would take a whole show to go into that would impact why they would look at somebody else and ascribe a negative motive. Why would they look at themselves and ascribe a innocence kind of narrative to, how they were in a situation. So there's a lot of things that could go into it, but, I kind of see the development of this narrative as you're describing it as something that is kind of psychologically fitting for how we interact with information and with our own histories.
No, to play the devil's advocate, if you will, it's entirely possible that I could, form a conversion narrative where I see God working behind the scenes to get me where I am, where it was all a bunch of coincidence and so forth. And it's possible the deconvert could have an actual real view that people were manipulating them and using them and so forth. So the fact that I am sitting here as a Christian apologist telling this is not me trying to ascribe motive to, or, pass a value claim upon either the conversion or deconversion narrative. Although I think that if we're going to be honest with ourselves, probably our conversion or deconversion narratives don't reflect 100% accurately what actually happened in the real world. beyond our perceptions. So yeah, I had a follow-up, but I've lost my train of thought. Continue.
That's fine. Maybe it had a rescue experience.
Let's hope.
I do have a question. So I'm not sure of like kind of how you guys want to tackle things. I know there are a couple corollary like kind of things to the model that we wanted to kind of discuss through. But I do have a question, and actually I wrote down three. One of them I think you addressed, although I might still want to ask it. I think two of them can be combined into one question. In general, as I'm thinking through this and I'm hearing what you're saying here after all of this research and study that you've done, in my mind I'm thinking, what's the solution? Like, how do what's the next step? How do we fix it? The more technical way, and maybe it's because I'm a marketing guy, I don't know, but the more technical way of answering this question is what immediately intrigues me is if this is the process, right? If this is what people are, very typically in your research going through so consistently such that you've been able to develop a model around it and that people typically are going to fit this model, then, would it be prudent that there are some apologists who kind of take a look at your model? I mean, is your model useful for an apologist who says, how can I contribute? And they pick a niche, if you will. They laser focus on one particular area of this and say, I'm going to make it my mission to help people who are struggling with this phase of the process. For example, I think of people who like, I'm just going to take Mike Heiser because I'm a fan of his lately. I've been really digging into his stuff lately. And certainly he has his own set of things that he teaches. But one of the kind of backdrops, one of the consistencies is kind of a, if you will, a debunking of the textualism that you described, right? It's like if there was one thread that in this list of things that you went through that his ministry would address, it would be this idea of textualism, where he comes in and he's helping a lot of people to rid themselves of the false belief that you have to think that way, that you have to think that, that you're necessarily going to be reading it and it has to mean the same thing to you, as it did to the first century person. And it just so happens that they have to understand it the same way you do, or else you're, not anyway, you get the point because you're the one who did the model. But so it occurs to me that, now there's a risk there, right? Because the risk is you start to open up people who before were very conservative and they start to question, they start, oh, this is an actual evangelical Christian who believes this. But now there's this fine line between, like, when do they start going down the slippery slope, or do they take this and they say, oh, so this isn't what I thought it was, and they're able to maintain. I definitely think you have people who are probably leaving because these kind of efforts are out there, but I would think it's maybe not as many as those who are staying as a result of them. So I guess do you understand? The question is, like, could people use this model to say, okay, I'm going to make this, maybe if it's not the total focus of my ministry, maybe this is an idea within the process and I'm going to latch on to that I could really get good at explaining and help, in a sense, coach people through, to help them understand that this is a false belief they have and they need to get rid of it. And here's why. Is it useful for that?
I think that probably the most useful thing for apologetics to come out of this model would be to take a look at the setting conditions, these modes of operation that one sees in the modal typical church. I think that you would see a lot less of this kind of thing if the church became an open environment in which discussions were allowed to be had and where I don't know became an acceptable answer. So, I come from a series of churches wherein the creationism was taught as gospel truth and, not to be questioned. And those people who questioned it were in some way less Christian than those who didn't. And, this creates sort of this internal environment wherein Christians question Christians and they kind of try to self-correct each other. and so forth. And I don't have any problem with questioning other Christians and correcting them. I have a problem with a lack of intellectual humility. Intellectual humility being the idea that I accept that I could be wrong about things, and I'm open to that, and you don't see a whole lot of intellectual humility in the church. One is not allowed to accept that they might be wrong about things. You have to be certain, this compelled certainty. And so if we could somehow get rid of or reduce the isolationism, allow our kids to have unchristian friends and to, hear evolutionary biology taught in the school and things like that. If we were to reduce the textualism, as you suggested, allow that there might be other ways of understanding the scripture that are not inconsistent with the existence of God. If you were to reduce somewhat the performance control and trust people to make decisions as adults for themselves, allow people to raise their kids. Yeah, allow them to impart their values. I don't take that from a Muslim or an atheist. I accept that they're sovereign over their own children, and as long as they're not physically or sexually molesting their children, they have the right and the responsibility to raise their children as they best see. And those children will eventually become adults who are autonomous and can make their own decisions. And so I would say the same to any Christian parent: raise your kid as you see best. They're your responsibility. But, allow adults within the church to make their own decisions and live with the consequences, and be there as supportive to them, but not as condemnatory toward them.
Okay. I think that makes sense. Okay, so I have another question that might be kind of related, but it might bring us back to the performance thing too soon.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it will or not. So let me
before you jump in on that real quick. I just had one thing I wanted to throw out there while we're talking about this. I very much see that the kind of flip side of this, and maybe even, to stick with the analogy of a train, maybe even the tracks cross at some point. But it seems to me that true discipleship, in terms of the community, the support of one another, walking through scripture and developing a right understanding of these things, constantly morphing your theology to be more in line with what you study. True discipleship seems to very much combat, the conditions, the stresses, the triggers, and prepare even for that processing stage. I think true discipleship, as we understand it from the Bible, is really kind of prepared for this exact thing.
If I could come in on that for a moment.
Yeah.
Obviously this concern of the shrinkage of the American church and so forth has been prescient upon apologists. And so you see a lot of books being written about how to preserve, keep young people from leaving the church and so forth. And apologetics has been seen as sort of the solution to this. I think there might be some truth in that, but not because apologists are there providing answers. Rather, apologists are allowing Christians the freedom to ask questions and to explore those questions. And, this constant having to censor myself from asking questions is one of these accumulated stressors. The ability to ask questions and to adopt this idea that, hey, it's possible that I might be wrong about things, and that's okay. It's okay to, discover that I've made a mistake or that I was wrong about things. That's not something to be guilty about, and it's not a failing on my part. To open the church intellectually to ask questions, to have discussions, to accept that I don't know might be an answer, and to accept that it's possible I might be wrong about something, relieves a lot of the stressors that are placed upon a church that is putting itself in a position where I have to be perfect about everything and I have to be right about everything.
That's awesome. That's really great to hear. I texted my couple pastors at my church a while ago and told them they needed to watch this, and I think they'll be pretty happy to hear what you just said, because that's the one thing that we're really making a very concerted effort to foster at our church is this environment where, you know, disagreement's acceptable and questions are okay, and we're, you know, really trying to understand the why behind the what, and realizing that nobody's going to be perfect, and that there are no perfect, you know, that there are perfect answers, but that doesn't mean that we have them at every moment or at any given moment.
You know, and I think this is why you sometimes see resistance to apologetics in modal typical churches, not because apologetics is coming along and explaining things, but rather because apologetics is allowing questions to be asked.
Yes. So I think my question, if I'm good to move on to that, is related actually to that. So I'm glad you brought up that angle. You mentioned a lot of people writing books about, you know, what keeps kids in the faith or whatever. Have you read Sticky Faith by Kara Powell and Chap Clark? Either of you? Okay. No. So I haven't read it either.
Awesome story, bro.
Right. I plan to. I've been meaning to for a long time, but I have read a synopsis, a multi-part blog kind of synopsis from a very trusted resource of mine. And if I were to just kind of summarize without going into the technical details, because I don't know them, the general gist of that, of the book, what they come to the conclusion of is that, yes, while there need to, you know, kids want answers to their questions, the biggest thing that they found in their research tended to be an inconsistency between faith and practice in very immediate influences, like their parents and the friends of their parents. You know, where it was the kind of thing where if the number was like astronomically high in terms of statistics, I wish I could remember exactly what it was, but it was something like, you know, in families where the children were taught the things of the Bible, but then they witnessed like their father actively doing things like within the community, making a difference in the real world that saw him, and then the rest of the family, you know, following suit, actually living out the faith which they claim to believe. That seemed to be a tremendous factor in whether or not the children, you know, eventually retained or preserved, I think is the word that they mainly used, preserved faith. Beyond that was that, like, if they saw dad, particularly mom and dad, but particularly dad, living out his faith, there was a way higher chance that they were going to end up sticking with it and sticking through it, even in the face of some of their doubts. I guess, does that in your model, does that kind of inconsistency, is that kind of in one of the stressors, like cognitive dissonance or something like that? Is that, or rather the setting conditions? Is that where that would live, or has your research indicated anything about that? Or
so
I don't remember hearing much about it. So
it's interesting to me because one of the things I noticed as I was doing my study is how many of these people came out of ministry families. They had a parent or a grandparent or something that was involved in the ministry in some way, shape, or form, and a high percentage of them did. And so you had this sort of preacher's kid / missionary kid phenomena that was occurring where they were kind of going off the rails. And, you know, I can't put my finger on why that is, you know, why coming from a ministry family would, you know, be one of these setting conditions for a deconversion. But there was a high percentage of that, and I don't know why.
I mean, I might have a little bit of insight as to that. I mean, and, you know, without, you know, going too much into it, I think a lot of times it has to do with, because I, you know, and I'm, again, this is not like an indictment on anybody in my family at all, but, you know, my wife is a pastor's kid. and you certainly, there's a greater pressure associated with that.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like, and I think anybody, most PKs would agree with that statement. Like, it has nothing to do with whether, with anything to say about the character or whatever of the person, of the pastor or whatever. It's more so just you're under a spotlight, and there's a pressure to kind of be a certain way and act a certain way, et cetera. And I think that for a lot of people, that's a lot of mental anxiety that is placed upon. It's very much a stressor, I think is fair to say. That mental pressure to be a certain way and act a certain way and look a certain way and conform to a certain kind of ideal, where maybe your family, they say, they put it this way before, like being in a glass house, like just being really subject to everybody's opinions and thoughts, etc. And then just one day, they have one of those trigger experiences and they crack underneath the pressure. So that, I think that definitely could be a contributing factor to that insight.
Yeah, and I've heard that, and that's kind of a truism. And it may in fact be the case. I don't tend to hold stock by truisms until I've got actual data to back them up. But
Good.
yeah, I mean, could very well be the case.
Excellent.
But yeah, so at some point, one of the things I wanted to explore, because this is the question that is, every time I present my research on a Christian forum, I'm sure you and I belong to some similar forums.
Yes.
Yes?
Oh, yeah. I was just agreeing with you.
Yeah. Okay. So is this idea, well, they probably weren't Christian at all. They were probably never saved. And unfortunately, there's no sociological study you can do that speaks to one's salvation status. That's not something I have access to via research. And so, I had wanted, and I assume that you're the guy that Caleb got for this, to talk to the issue of salvation, because that's the foremost issue on Christians' minds. I've been on a couple of atheist shows now talking about my research, and of course they have different concerns than I do, or than Christians might. And so I try to answer their questions. But the question that the Christian community has been asking about this every time I talk about my research is, well, were they saved in the first place? And so that's one of the discussions I was thinking we ought to have tonight. And I'm ready for that whenever you guys are.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Caleb did ask me about that. And one of the things I immediately told him was what I said earlier, that, I don't know how many answers I have. I think I have more questions, almost, than I do answers. But I do have a way of thinking about it that, again, Heiser, was kind of an instrumental, figure in my coming to think this way. More and more, I think one of the things that I'm getting into is this idea that, you in some contexts where you grow up, there's this sharp distinction made between Old Testament theology and practice and belief and New Testament theology and practice and belief. And, there was only 400 years in between when, the events of the one, ended, 400 years or so between the events of the one ended and when the events of the other kind of, began and were being written about and such. And it's interesting that this dichotomy is made, and people just don't think about the fact that the early church was extremely Jewish and had a very, Jewish mindset, and that Jesus was Jewish. I mean, they called him rabbi, and he was, that's what. So you kind of you miss this context, and so there is and I don't know if it's the fault of like hyper dispensationalism or something. I don't know what it is, but there's this this line that has been drawn between the two that I think is very unhelpful, and I think it's actually made some unhelpful distinctions in this area. So, the question of eternal security, right? That's really where where we're headed down. And people want to know, is it once saved, always saved? Is it, can you, if you, how's it go? Like if you get into a car wreck or whatever and you cuss the moment before you die, have you sinned against God and taken his name in vain and then you're headed to heaven? These kind of silly kind of things. It's interesting because I don't think that it's that. I think those are all the wrong questions to ask. And
Mhm.
so the position that I find myself in when somebody asks me that question, because I get it all the time, is, these days it's like, is that the right question to ask? So here's the way that I'm thinking about this lately, and would be intrigued to have your thoughts on it. And if you want to dive into the more traditional discussion, we can do that too. But just fair warning, I don't have many answers along the traditional discussion because I think some of the questions might be wrong.
Mhm.
So I think one of the right questions is, well, how was belief formed in the Old Testament, and what does the New Testament say about how old people believed? And we all know that many of these questions are going to quickly get us into the book of Hebrews, right? That's where a lot of this stuff is discussed. And I think
It
in
exists
Hebrews,
for a reason.
that's exactly right? Somebody wrote it. It exists for a reason. And Hebrews 11 kind of has a lot to say about the way or the kinds of people that believed and what the content of their faith was. Hebrews 10, as most of us know, has a lot to say about what can invite salvation into the life of someone and what cannot invite salvation into the life of someone. And where Heiser comes in is I think he's just put helpful language around it. That's all. But I think he uses the term believing loyalty. And the idea is it's built on, two things that are, I think, true. If you look at the Bible, one of them is that what you cannot gain via moral perfection, you cannot lose via moral imperfection. So a lot of people caricature the debate as if you sin against God in some certain way, you can lose your salvation. In other words, you can lose your salvation based on, and even in the psychological manipulation and all the performance-based Christianity and that kind of stuff is where you really see this, right? This idea of if I sin before God, X amount of times, if I repent for this thing and then I do this bad thing again, now God doesn't like me anymore and I might not make it to heaven. And so you go to these events that are oftentimes very psychologically, like some revival meetings and stuff, and they're very psychologically manipulating, and they'll start to make you doubt that you believe. And the reason that you doubt that you believe in these events is because you're made to feel bad because you might have some sort of sin in your life. And hello, I mean, I'm a human, you're a human. I think you're all a human here. We sin sometimes, and it's not good and it's not excusable, but we do it. Okay. And if it's true that you can't gain favor with God, you can't gain salvation by being morally perfect, that we know that's false, because we're not morally perfect. We can't be morally perfect. The whole point of the gospel is that Christ was morally perfect and he satisfied the requirements, and we can be with the Lord on his dime, kind of thing. And so if we can't gain it that way, then why think we can lose it that way? So that's one, I think, of the poles of this believing loyalty equation. The second one is everyone who is in heaven, okay, believes. No one is in heaven right now who does not believe or who did not believe. In order to be in the believing community, you had to believe. That was the condition, always. And you look back at these Old Testament saints. Abraham. Did Abraham sin? Did he get himself in trouble? Did he do bad things? Did he tell lies? It's all right there in the pages, right? We can read it. It's there. What did he, the problem is regardless of those things he did, he never wavered in his believing loyalty to Yahweh. His faith was in Yahweh. He wasn't a Baal worshiper. He worshiped Yahweh. He messed up, but he worshiped Yahweh. David. I mean, how many times is David just the chief example of somebody who sinned after sin after sin and just all these terrible things, and he even gets called out on it in Scripture and judged for it in Scripture. We can read it, and yet his believing loyalty, his faith in Yahweh, made it such that, this man is somebody who is said to have a man after God's own heart. He's in the line of Christ, for heaven's sake. I mean, he is a model of somebody that we should be like, and yet he did these bad, things. So what the Old Testament seems to say, and what all the cases we have in the New Testament seem to say, is that somebody who believes is saved. You can be saved eternally, but you have to believe. And if you read the latter parts of Hebrews 5 and going into Hebrews 6, you start to find out that you have to endure in belief to the end, because nobody is in heaven who does not believe. You don't get to be on this earth and then get to this point where you say, no, I don't believe, and then not be in heaven. Now, somebody, or be in heaven, excuse me. And I'm using the in heaven as kind of like just a general term of, be with the Lord. Okay. Now somebody might want to ask the question, but like, could they make a decision, right, to not believe? Here's the thing. I mean, if somebody says they legitimately believed, they've been through all the things or whatever, can they at a later point in time say that they didn't believe? Well, I think the only way to do that is you'd have to say that they were somehow lying, right? That they were just totally lying about their belief before. And that requires me, if I have to say something like that, that requires me to ascribe motive to somebody that I probably don't even know. And how can I make myself that omniscient? That I would have to be omniscient to be able to truthfully answer that question. And so that's why I say, even if it's not like the wrong question for a theologian who's interested in answering it, I don't think it's a helpful question. I think what's important is that you can't lose something via moral imperfection that you can't gain via moral perfection. And no one is in heaven right now who does not believe. The only way to be in heaven is to believe. So those are the two things. I mean, if you do those two things, then, and if those two things are true, then that person is a Christian. So it doesn't really answer the question, I don't think, but I think it raises a better way of talking about the things that matter. And I want y'all to come in on that, but something that I think there's also, the reason why I asked about the believing community idea before is because I think too, there might be a unhelpful thing here in terms of thinking of conversion as a moment in time, a specific second in the clock of time. I've heard people say, it's just all these pastorisms and preacherisms and stuff. But, I've heard people say something like, I believe that, it's common to think that the person who comes down before, comes down the aisle and gets in the altar, and then like that's where they get saved, or they get taken behind the baptistry or whatever, and somebody opens a Bible and shows them how to be saved, and they go through that, and then they've been saved. Well, it's pretty popular, at least in the circles I come from, to say something like, hey, praise God for that. Hey, I believe that the moment she got up out of her chair and started to walk down the aisle, when she took that first step, that was the moment that she got saved, kind of, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. That really happens. And it almost, to tell it that almost sounds ridiculous, but it's kind of like, is that really how it happens? I don't know. Again, I'm not raising any, because I know we see things in the Bible where it's like, and like when Peter preached in Acts 2, and about 3,000 souls were added to the church. Was it, is it true that it's always the specific moment in time, or is it more of a process that somebody goes through, learning more about themselves and learning more about who God is and about how they relate? And, maybe there's a moment in time at which it clicks, but as long as somebody is placing their belief in Yahweh, according to Scripture, they're saved. If they are legitimately placing belief that he is who he said he is, that Christ is who he said he was, that Christ did for them what Christ said he did for them, and, demonstrated with his life, then that person believes. And if they endure in their belief to the end, and put it in the words of Journey, and don't stop believing, then they're saved. right? It just seems like such a more helpful way to think about it than to say, oh, is OSAS, is once saved always saved, true, or was this person lying? I think that requires me to be omniscient, and I'm not.
So yeah, I think it's important to make a distinction between conversion and salvation. You're not saved until you're saved. I didn't get up from the baptistry a perfect, sinless human being, with one-on-one connection with God at all times, both sending and receiving. There's a difference between me ideologically adopting Christianity as my belief system and God, adopting me as a child and getting that promissory note of redemption and resurrection from God.
So how do you think through that? Because what you just said kind of sounds like you can say you believe in God, but at that time, him not grant you the, eternal security, so to speak. So is that what you would tend to think, that eternal security is not granted until a later point in time, even though you ideologically accept it? Or how does that work?
Well, one is plumbing the depths of the human mind, which I'm equipped to do. The other is plumbing the depths of the mind of God, which I am not equipped to do. So
Understood.
I can tell you if a person has proclaimed and identified with the Christian community. That's something we can measure and we can gauge. I cannot tell you if God has put this person in the Lamb's Book of Life or whatnot for future resurrection. So I can say that person has definitely deconverted. They have lost their faith. They have left the belief. This is a thing I can measure. I can also say that they once were in the faith, and I can use behaviors to indicate this as measurements for it. What I can't say is what's going on with God on that end, on his end of the thing. So yeah, when we use the word terms, I think conversion and salvation need to be disambiguated from one another.
It seems to me this is actually really helpful. And I never thought about it that way. I have a buddy, excuse me, who I grew up with, who would always ask this question whenever this was raised up, because I'm very Baptist and his family was very Pentecostal, and he was kind of like wherever. He's like, I'm the Bible, whatever that is. And one of the things that he always asked me was, when does it say? Does it say when a person's name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life? Like, we know that's the metric that matters, right? And when. And I think the answer to that question is from before the foundation of the world. And if that's the answer to that question, then I think it's probably true that we just can't know. Like, I think that's a tangible way from Scripture to show that we just can't know who is saved and who is not saved. And therefore we can say, based on behavioral analysis and things like that, that somebody is converted or deconverted. But I would just ask, I guess you would have to just ask somebody if they wondered, well, is eternal security true? You could just ask them, well, do you know whose names have been written in the Lamb's Book of Life from before the foundation of the world? And if the answer is no, then I think it's an impossible question to answer.
So this is something we're going to probably have to turn into part two, because we're gone for almost 3 hours now.
Let me jump in with a couple thoughts real quick. In talking about being written in the Book of Life, there's also something we find in the early chapters of Revelation about the church at Sardis, and it discusses being blotted out. And in the towns then, you own property, your name would be blotted out if you died and that property went to somebody else. I just throw that out there as a thought. But I think in general, with this whole topic, and to kind of sum up and circle back around to everything you guys have kind of brought into this, I want to stick with Paul's kind of metaphor of a race. It takes a lot of work to get to a race. You have to really prepare for that 5K to get in there and get to it. Once you get there, can you sit down and say, hey, I was in a race? Sure, you can sit down right over the start line, but you also haven't ran that race. You were in it. You didn't run it. So I think there's a lot of things that we can't know because we're not omniscient. We don't know the things God does. We can have comparisons. I think the race metaphor is about as good as we can get as to what this whole process looks like. But it is so extra dimensional to what we see in our little 2D world down here compared to the 3D, 4D, 5D reality that is present. That, you know, things like infant baptism, does that have any impact on protecting someone's life? I mean, all these questions come in. And while we can't have direct answers, I think we can see that, you know, it's something more complex than we can put a pin in and say, this person was saved then, they lost it, or, you know, this person was never saved to begin with. It's not our call to make. And I think things are too big for us to really even begin to think about making that call.
Hey, Caleb.
Yeah.
Can you do something for me real quick? I need to see something.
Okay.
Can you say, I'm Caleb Johnston, and you're listening to 105 Light FM?
I'm Caleb Johnston, and you're listening to 105 FM.
I knew it. I knew it.
Okay. There
You're
you go.
the guy.
No, I'm not, but it's late and I haven't had dinner, so my voice dropped like a lot.
Yeah, I really think we're going to have you back for a part 2, Steve, because I've actually got some thoughts on this, and it seems like it's a discussion that can go on for a while. So we're going to have to turn this into a 2-parter.
That'd be wonderful, because I'd really like to talk about the background too, about the modal typical church a little bit more, and the performance-based stuff. That would be a good second piece of this. It's you know, we're only talking about potentially the most important concept in human life. So, you know, if it takes 2 episodes, I guess it'll be okay to cover.
And the last 3 years of my life too. So
yes, absolutely. Good. I appreciate you know, y'all having the discussion. I think this is awesome.
Well, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's been good. It's been good to have you on. So to wrap this up where we're at, Joel, give the 30-second pitch as to where they can go and read more on your research.
Okay, so given that I've been doing so much research over such a long time, I actually have a couple of social media feeds that I keep up to date pretty regularly. If you want to get the constant update on my research and my thoughts on it, the best place to go is to follow my Facebook page, Switching Sides. So I call it Switching Sides because I'm studying both conversion and deconversion. And then I also have a Twitter feed at Sides Switching. That's 2 S's, SIDESSWITCHES. I mean, ing. Anyway, you get it.
I get it.
So that's the best place to follow the research that I am currently doing.
All
and
right.
I did another, followers of the podcast will have heard the podcast interview that I did on our Atheist podcast. I've done another one now, and hopefully I'll be able to air the audio from that at some point in the future as well.
Cool. Steve, how about you? Where can listeners find more of you?
Absolutely. Well, if you dare to type the name Schramm, that's my last name, you can go to steveschramm.com. Maybe easier to just go to BibleNerdPodcast.com, BibleNerdPodcast.com, and that'll take you to the podcast subscribe page on my website, but you can find the rest of everything on my website there. Typically
whoa. You're the Bible nerd? You're the Bible nerd?
Oh, I am the Bible nerd. I'm the one.
Whoa.
Yep. Whoa, right? Yeah, so if you just go there, you can find everything that's there. Typically, I do an article a week, and then the podcast that I do every week is based on the article that I wrote. So you can kind of have it, have it all. You'll get a little extra bonus content if you listen to the audio. But you could consume it either way. And I'm a little bit on a hiatus right now with that because I've got some business stuff going on where I'm just like really overwhelmed. I needed to take a break for a few weeks. So I'm taking a break for a few weeks right now, but there's 150, I don't know, something plus episodes out there and stuff now. So, and lots of articles and stuff to read. So that's where you can find me.
Hey, Steve, Is there any way in the world we could get you into a rap battle with the Bible geek?
Oh boy, that would be pretty tough. My rap skills are lacking, to say the least.
Are you familiar with the Bible geek?
I am not, but maybe I need to check that out.
Yeah, I think if I've got the name right, I believe the Bible geek is an atheist that has a podcast about the Bible.
Ah, interesting. Okay, yeah.
What's his name? Steve Price?
Not another Steve. That would be way too coincidental.
Oh man, I'll tell you, bluegrass is a little bit more my scene, so I'll get into a guitar battle or a bass battle with him any day. But a rap battle, I don't know. I'm pretty sure I would lose that by default.
Is it Dan Barker?
We'll have Adam Coleman give you some lessons.
There you go. Yes.
Hold up, I'm pulling this up. Dan Barker. I think he's the Bible geek.
Really?
If my computer would move.
Well,
basically, the guy I'm thinking of was somebody that I did a profile on for deconversion, and
yeah, I don't know. Let's see. I'm trying to look it up here, but I'm not having much.
yeah,
Robert Price. Robert Price, is that right? The Bible geek?
Robert Price. Yeah, the Bible geek.
Robert
Okay,
Price.
yeah. He was one of the deconverts that I did a thing on, and he basically has like 3 PhDs, and he attended like 2 seminaries and got degrees in all kinds of Bible stuff. He just crammed his brain full of Bible knowledge, and then he became an atheist, but he had all this Bible knowledge he needed to do something with. So he's still very hung up on the Bible as a piece of literature and all of the cultural and historical backgrounds that come from it. So he does his own podcast on the Bible and stuff, but as an atheist. So I want to see the Bible nerd go up against the Bible geek.
Yeah, I think our next debate is already planned out now.
Yeah, that classic geek versus nerd dichotomy right there.
Yep. All right, listeners. Well, we will hope to be back with a part 2 of this eventually, since I think this is now our record longest episode by a little bit. So
I'd have to cut it up in editing.
I know we can definitely get some good segments from this one, but
it's probably my fault, guys. I'm extremely long-winded. So
what had happened was exactly what I knew was going to happen. I went over the modal typical church, and that became the whole episode. So it should have been 2 episodes. I should have saved all that stuff for another episode. But yeah, we can do an episode on the salvation issue, and I have some thoughts about that as well.
Sweet.
All right. Well, people, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and we will see you next time.